For 18 years, the distance between Russell Brennan and his daughter was 3,000 miles the distance from a smokejumper base in Fairbanks, Alaska, to a small farmhouse in Vermont. He had crossed those 3,000 miles only in his prayers, his letters, and his memory of holding her on the day she was born. He had jumped out of airplanes for 20 years and protected homes and forests across the American West, but he had never been able to cross those 3,000 miles to be the kind of father he wanted to be. So he had done the only loving thing he could think of. He had let her go. And on a Wednesday afternoon last autumn, on the stage of America's most beloved game show, those 3,000 miles disappeared in 18 seconds when Steve Harvey turned to him and quietly said 4 words. "She's right behind you." The Brennan family from Portland, Maine, was facing off against the Delacroix family from Baton Rouge, Louisiana. The Brennans were a tight, weathered, sun-creased crew of former firefighters and smoke jumpers. Russell at the center, his older brother Patrick, his cousin Eamon, his best friend and former smoke jumping partner Marcus Hale, and Marcus's wife Teresa, who had insisted she counted as family on account of having fed every single one of them dinner at least 100 times over the years. They were the kind of family you could spot from across a parking lot. Quiet eyes, steady hands. That particular calm that comes from people who have spent their lives walking into places everyone else is running away from and asking nothing in return. Russell stood in the middle of his line, tall and broad-shouldered, with the kind of close-cropped silver hair that suggested he had only recently stopped getting it cut at a Forest Service base. He wore a simple navy blue polo shirt and khakis. He looked, to anyone watching, like a man who had finally learned how to relax and was still figuring out what to do with his hands. Steve had taken to him immediately, during the warm-up. There was something about Russell that made Steve slow down. Steve had interviewed senators and movie stars and Olympic athletes, and he had learned over the years that the most interesting people in any room were almost always the quietest ones. Russell was one of those. "Now, Russell," Steve had said during the introductions, "I'm reading here that you just retired, 20 years as a smoke jumper. Is that right?" Russell had nodded, a small, almost embarrassed smile crossing his face. "Yes, sir. 20 years and 4 months. 20 years and 4 months, Steve repeated, grinning. "See, that's a man who counted. Now I gotta ask you, brother, because half my audience is sitting here going, what in the world is a smoke jumper? Tell the people what you did for 20 years. Russell looked out at the audience, that quiet smile still on his face. Smoke jumpers are wildland firefighters who parachute into remote areas to fight wildfires before they reach communities. We get on a plane, we fly out over the wilderness, and when the spotter tells us we're over the drop zone, we jump." The audience made an impressed sound. Steve raised his eyebrows so high they nearly disappeared into his hairline. "You jumped out of planes? Into the woods? On purpose?" "Yes, sir. Mostly out of Fairbanks, Alaska. Mostly out of Fairbanks, Alaska," Steve repeated, shaking his head. "Now see, that's the difference between you and me, brother, because if a plane door opens over the Alaska wilderness, I am staying inside that plane. I'm going to be holding on to that plane like it owes me money." The audience burst out laughing. Russell laughed too, that quiet, rumbling laugh of a man who had heard every plane joke there was and still found them funny. "How many homes you think you saved in 20 years?" Steve asked. Russell shrugged, looking down at the podium. "I don't really keep count, Steve. You just do the next jump, and then the next one." "You don't keep count," Steve repeated, looking out at the audience. "Y'all hear that? This man jumped out of planes, into the wilderness for 20 years, protecting houses and forests and families he was never even gonna meet, and he says he doesn't keep count. That's a hero right there." "That right there is a real American hero," the audience applauded. Russell's brother Patrick clapped him on the back. Russell looked like he wanted to disappear into his polo shirt. Steve let the moment breathe and then moved down the line. He met Patrick, a recently retired schoolteacher who had spent 35 years teaching middle school history in Portland. He met Eamon, who ran a small lobster boat operation off the Maine coast. He met Marcus Hale, who had jumped alongside Russell for 12 of those 20 years and now ran a wilderness safety school for kids. And he met Teresa, who told Steve she had 3 jobs, nurse, mother, and smoke jumper's wife, and that the third one was the hardest. Steve laughed and turned back toward the center of the stage. But as he did, He caught Russell's expression. Russell was smiling at Teresa's joke, but there was something else there too. Something Steve had seen on the faces of a lot of people over the years. A sadness so old and so settled in that the person carrying it had stopped noticing it themselves. Steve filed it away and moved on with the game. The first round began. Patrick was at the buzzer for the Brennans, and the question was, name something a person might do to celebrate their retirement. Patrick slapped the buzzer and shouted, "Take a long trip!" The board lit up with the number 2 answer, and the Brennans were on the board. The game moved smoothly through the first round. The Brennans were charming and funny, and absolutely terrible at predicting survey answers, which somehow made them more endearing to the audience. The Delacroix family from Louisiana was polished and quick, led by a charismatic grandmother named Yvette, who had everyone in the studio eating out of her hand within the first 3 minutes. Between questions, Steve kept returning to Russell, asking little things, questions a host doesn't usually ask. What was his favorite jump? What was the coldest he had ever been? What did he miss most about the work? The mornings, Russell said quietly when Steve asked the last one. There's a thing that happens at a smokejumper base in the morning. Right before the day really starts, everybody gathers on the loft floor, the riggers and the jumpers and the pilots, and we just take a minute together. Whatever's coming, whatever the day holds, we take that minute. And for those couple seconds, you remember why you signed up. I miss that. The studio went a little quieter. Steve nodded slowly. That's beautiful, brother. That is really beautiful. He moved on to the next question. But the producers in the booth had noticed something. They had been told, weeks ago, what was coming today. They had been preparing for this moment for almost 3 months. And they could see, the way Steve was talking to Russell, that he was going to make this even bigger than they had planned. The second round belonged to the Delacroix family. Yvette Delacroix was a force of nature, and her family rode her energy all the way to the round's end with a perfect sweep. The Brennans applauded good-naturedly. Russell shook Yvette's hand across the divide between podiums and told her his grandmother would have loved her. Yvette laughed and told Russell that any man who said something that sweet about another man's grandmother could be in her family anytime he liked. It was during the commercial break before the third round that things began to shift. Steve walked over to the Brennan family with a bottle of water in his hand and stopped in front of Russell. Russell, can I ask you something kind of personal, brother? Russell looked up. Of course, Steve. Earlier, when I asked everybody about their families, you talked about your brother and your cousin and your friends. But you didn't mention if you had any kids. I'm not trying to put you on the spot. I can read people pretty good after all these years, and there's something I'm seeing in your face that I want to understand. Russell looked at Steve for a long moment. The studio lights were warm. The audience was quietly chatting during the break. Russell took a slow breath. I have a daughter, Steve. Steve nodded gently. Tell me about her. Russell's voice was so quiet that Steve had to lean in. Her name is Junie, June Elizabeth Brennan, but everyone called her Junie. I haven't seen her in 18 years. Not in person, anyway. Steve felt his stomach drop a little. He had been a host long enough to know when he was standing on the edge of something sacred. He set the water bottle down on the podium. Russell, are you okay talking about this on the show? Because if you're not, we don't have to. I'm asking you man to man right now. Russell was quiet for a moment. Then he said, You know what, Steve? I've spent 18 years not talking about it. Maybe it's time I did. Steve nodded once. Okay, brother. When we come back from break, we're going to take a minute. Is that all right? Russell nodded. Steve walked back to his mark and signaled to his producers. The producers in the booth, who had been holding their breath for almost 2 hours, exchanged a look. The executive producer pressed her hand to her earpiece and whispered, It's happening earlier than we planned. Get her ready. Backstage. In a small green room with a single mirror and a folded photograph of an old propeller plane on the wall, a 21-year-old newly licensed commercial pilot was sitting with her hands folded in her lap. Her name was June Brennan-Coyle. Her stepfather, a kind and patient civil engineer named Daniel Coyle, had legally adopted her when she was 5 years old, and she had taken his name with the gentle blessing of the man whose blood ran through her veins. She was wearing the brand-new uniform of a regional airline first officer, a crisp navy blue blazer with 3 gold stripes on each epaulet, a starched white shirt underneath, a slim navy tie, dark trousers, polished black shoes. On her left chest, just above the pocket, were her gold wings, the small gleaming pin every pilot in America earns the day they're cleared to fly commercial. Her dark hair was pulled back into a neat low bun. Her pilot's combination cap rested on the chair beside her, the gold band around the brim catching the light. In her gloved hands, she held a single photograph. She had wanted the sky for as long as she could remember. Her mother used to joke that Junie had asked for a model airplane for her 2nd birthday and never asked for anything else for the rest of her childhood. She had grown up in landlocked Vermont, the daughter of a civil engineer and a high school librarian, and she had no rational explanation for why she had felt, since she was small, that she belonged in the air. None of her family on her mother's or stepfather's side had ever flown a plane. None of them had ever even taken flying lessons. But Junie had filled her bedroom with model aircraft and aviation posters and old photos of bush pilots, and when she had announced at 14 that she wanted to apply to Embry-Riddle Aeronautical University, her parents had not been surprised. On her 18th birthday, her mother had sat her down on the back porch of their Vermont home and told her, gently and completely, the story of her biological father. She had told her about Russell, about the young smokejumper she had married at 22, about the long fire seasons in Alaska that took him away for months at a time, about the loneliness of being a young mother 3,000 miles from her husband, about moving home to Maine with baby Junie to be near her parents, about how the marriage had slowly, gently, sadly come apart, not because of any cruelty or any wrong, but because 2 very young people had been asked to do a very hard thing and had not been ready. About the divorce that had been signed in tears across a kitchen table, with both of them agreeing that whatever happened next, Junie would be the priority. About meeting Daniel 2 years later. About falling in love with a man who was already, somehow, a father in his soul. About Russell flying out to Vermont to meet Daniel before anything became serious, and the 2 men sitting on a park bench for 3 hours while Junie napped in a stroller, and Russell finally putting his hand on Daniel's shoulder and saying, "She deserves a dad who can come home every night. I can't be that man right now. If you can be, I'll thank you for the rest of my life." Her mother had told her about the adoption papers Russell had signed when Junie was 5. About the single condition Russell had insisted on, his only request, that one day, when Junie was old enough to understand, she be told the truth, that she would never be lied to about where she came from, that if she ever wanted to find him, she would have a name and a way. And her mother had told her, with tears running down her face, that Russell had stayed at the smokejumper base for 20 years and had never remarried. Junie had asked her mother that night, on the back porch with the fireflies coming up, why she had never told her sooner. And her mother had said, "Because Daniel is your dad, sweetheart. He raised you, he loves you, and I didn't want you to feel like you had to choose. But you're 18 now, and you have a right to know your whole story." Junie had cried. She had hugged her mother. She had walked into the house and found Daniel reading in his armchair, and she had climbed into his lap like she was 6 years old again, and she had said, "You're my dad. You will always be my dad. And there's a man named Russell who I want to know." And Daniel had held her and whispered, "I've been waiting 18 years for you to say his name. I've been ready, sweetheart. I've always been ready." That had been 3 years ago. Junie had spent those 3 years preparing, reading every letter Russell had sent her over the years, and there had been letters, dozens of them, sent through her mother, full of small, careful words from a man trying not to overstep. She had looked at every photograph her mother had kept. She had learned the rhythm of her father's life from afar. She had committed to Embry-Riddle partly because of her own calling, and partly because, in some quiet corner of her heart, she had wanted her father to know that the sky had found her too. And 6 weeks ago, with the help of her mother and Daniel, and a producer at Family Feud who had been moved nearly to tears by the email Junie had sent, the plan had been put in motion. She had finished her commercial pilot certification 3 weeks before that. She had been hired by a regional airline almost immediately. Her wings had been pinned on at her training class graduation just 9 days before the taping. Now she sat in a green room in Atlanta in her brand new pilot uniform, holding a single photograph in her white-gloved hands. It was a picture of a 23-year-old Russell Brennan in his Forest Service smoke jumper jumpsuit, holding a newborn baby girl, his face split into the widest smile in the world. The photograph was creased and faded. Her mother had carried it in her wallet for 18 years. A producer leaned into the green room. "Junie, it's almost time." Junie nodded. She stood. She straightened her navy blazer. She picked up her combination cap and tucked it neatly under her left arm. She looked at herself in the mirror one last time. "Hi, Dad," she whispered. Out on the stage, Steve Harvey had returned from the commercial break and was standing in front of the Brennan family with an expression the audience had rarely seen on him. Soft, almost reverent. "Folks," Steve said, looking out at the studio, "we're going to do something a little different here for a few minutes. I want y'all to bear with me. Russell, would you come on out from behind the podium, brother?" Russell looked confused, but stepped out from behind the Brennan family line. His brother Patrick gave him a small, encouraging nod. Russell walked the few feet to the center of the stage where Steve was waiting. "Russell," Steve said, "I want you to tell the people what you just told me during the break about Junie. Take your time." Russell looked at Steve. He looked at the audience. He looked, for one long moment, at his own boots. Then he raised his head and began to speak. "I have a daughter," he said. "Her name is June Elizabeth. We called her Junie when she was little. She was born when I was 23 years old. I was based in Fairbanks, Alaska, with the Smokejumpers. And her mother was back home in Maine, and we were just two kids who loved each other and didn't know what we were doing." The audience was completely silent. Steve stood with his hands folded in front of him. "I was gone a lot." Russell continued. "Smoke jumping isn't a job where you go home for dinner. Fire season runs 5-6 months, sometimes longer. You're out for weeks at a stretch. And my wife, my ex-wife now, she was alone with a baby, and she was 22 years old, and it was hard. We did our best. We loved each other, but we were too young, and I was too far away. And after about 3 years, we sat down at our kitchen table, and we agreed that the best thing for Junie was for us to part as friends and let her have a real home." Russell paused. Steve handed him a handkerchief from his pocket. Russell waved it off gently and went on. "My wife met a wonderful man a couple years later. His name is Daniel. He's a civil engineer in Vermont. He's a kind man. He's the kind of man who shows up. And when Junie was about 5 years old, we all sat down, me and her mother and Daniel, and we made a decision together. Daniel adopted Junie. Legally. He became her dad, in every way that matters every single day. I signed those papers because I loved her enough to let her have a father who could come home every night and read her bedtime stories and be there for school plays. I couldn't be that man. Not on a smoke jumper's schedule. Not stationed where I was. A woman in the front row was openly crying now. Steve's eyes were wet. I asked for one thing," Russell said. "I asked that she be told the truth one day, when she was old enough. I didn't want her to grow up with a lie. I wanted her to know that somewhere out there was a man who had held her on the day she was born and had never, not for one day, not for 1 hour, stopped loving her. Her mother promised me. And she kept that promise." "When did your daughter find out?" Steve asked quietly. "On her 18th birthday. Her mother told me about it afterward." Junie cried. And then she went and hugged her dad, Daniel. And she told him he would always be her dad. And then she said she wanted to know me too, when she was ready. That was 3 years ago. Have you spoken to her, Russell?" Russell shook his head slowly. "I've written her letters. Through her mother. Just little things. Not too much. I never wanted her to feel pressured. I figured when she was ready, she would reach out. Her mother told me a few months ago that Junie was at Embry-Riddle, that she wanted to be a pilot. Nobody in her family had ever flown." I cried when I heard that, Steve. I cried because for 20 years I jumped out of airplanes. 20 years. And every single time I jumped, my life was in the hands of the pilot up front. Every single time. And to hear that my daughter had become one of those pilots, the kind of person I trusted with my life every day for 2 decades, I just thought, maybe somehow, somewhere deep down, she knew. Steve had to take a breath. He turned slightly toward the audience and pressed the back of his hand against his eye for just a second. Then he turned back.
Russell, I have to ask you something, brother, and I need you to know that whatever you say, we respect it.
If you could see Junie right now, today, after 18 years, what would you want her to know? Russell looked at Steve. The studio was so quiet you could hear the soft hum of the lights overhead. I would want her to know that I'm proud of her, Russell said. I would want her to know that not a single morning in 18 years has gone by where I didn't think about her. I would want her to know that when I retired 4 months ago, the first thing I did was drive to the little chapel near my old base and sit in the back pew and pray that someday I would get to tell her in person that letting her go was the hardest thing I ever did and the most loving thing I ever did, and I would do it again to give her the life she's had. He paused. His voice was steady, but his eyes were wet. And I would want her to know that I have never, not for 1 second, regretted being her father, even from far away, especially from far away. Because I learned what it means to love somebody by loving her quietly across 3,000 miles for 18 years. Steve Harvey put his hand over his mouth. The producer in the booth gave the crust. Signal. Russell, Steve said, his voice shaking. I want you to do something for me. I want you to turn around. Slowly, Russell blinked. What? Russell, brother, I need you to turn around. She's right behind you. Russell Brennan turned around, standing in the center aisle of the Family Feud studio. Framed by the warm wash of the stage lights was a young woman in the spotless navy blue uniform of a commercial airline first officer, crisp blazer with 3 gold stripes shining on her shoulders, white shirt, navy tie, gold pilot wings glinting on her chest, white gloves. Her combination cap was held neatly under her left arm. Her dark hair was pulled back into a clean, low bun. Her eyes, Russell's eyes, the same gray-blue as the sky above the Maine coast in November, were full of tears. For a long moment, neither of them moved. Russell's hand came up slowly to his mouth. He made a sound that wasn't quite a word. His knees buckled slightly, and his brother Patrick stepped forward instinctively, but Russell waved him off without looking. He took 1 step toward the center aisle, then another. Then he stopped. Junie, he whispered. The young woman in the pilot uniform began walking toward the stage. Her steps were measured and careful. She climbed the 3 steps onto the stage. She stopped 2 feet in front of him. Hi, Dad, she said. Russell Brennan, the retired smokejumper who had jumped out of airplanes into the Alaska wilderness for 20 years, who had walked into places everyone else was running from and asked nothing in return, the man who had not cried in front of another human being in longer than he could remember. Russell Brennan put both of his hands over his face, and his shoulders began to shake. Junie reached out and gently took his hands away from Long. His face. Dad, she said again. It's me. And Russell Brennan opened his arms, and his daughter walked into them, and for the first time in 18 years he held his little girl. The studio erupted. The audience was on its feet. The Delacroix family was hugging each other in the other podium. Yvette Delacroix had her hands clasped in front of her face and was openly weeping. The Brennan family had broken formation entirely. Patrick was crying into Eamon's shoulder. Marcus and Teresa Hale were holding each other. And Steve Harvey had walked several steps backward to give the father and daughter the space they needed. Russell held her like he was afraid she would dissolve. He held her like a man who had been waiting for the sky to bring something back to him for 2 decades and could not believe the sky had finally answered. Junie had her face buried in her father's shoulder, and her combination cap had slipped from under her arm and landed gently on the stage floor, and she was whispering something into his ear that no one else could hear. What she was whispering was, I knew. Somehow, I knew. After what felt like a very long time, Russell pulled back just enough to look at her face. He touched her cheek with the back of his fingers. He looked at her uniform. His eyes traveled from the gold buttons to the 3 stripes on her shoulders to the gold wings on her chest. You're a pilot, he said, his voice wrecked. First officer, sir. I just got my wings 9 days ago. I start flying with the airline next month. You went to Embry-Riddle. I did. I graduated this past spring. I got my commercial certificate in August and they hired me right away. Russell laughed through his tears. You picked the sky. I picked the sky, Dad. I don't even know why. Nobody in my family ever flew. Mom always said I came out of the womb pointing at airplanes. Russell laughed again, and the laugh turned into a sob, and he pulled her back into his arms. Steve Harvey stepped forward gently, microphone in hand. Junie, sweetheart, I'm going to ask you to come over here for just a second so the people at home can hear you. Is that all right? Junie nodded, wiping her eyes. She walked with her father to where Steve was standing, and Russell did not let go of her hand. Junie, Steve said, tell us how this happened. How are you here? Junie took a steadying breath. My mom told me about my dad on my 18th birthday. She told me everything. About how young they were, and about how hard it was, and about the choice my dad made when I was 5 so I could have a stable home with my stepdad Daniel. She didn't sugarcoat any of it. She told me my dad had written me letters for 13 years, and that she had kept every one of them in a box in her closet. Did you read them? Steve asked. I read every single one. All in one night. I sat on my bedroom floor with the box, and I read them from the first one to the last one. And by the end of it, I knew 2 things. I knew my dad loved me, and I knew I wanted to meet him. But I wanted to meet him as a grown person, not a kid. I wanted to be able to look him in the eye and tell him I understood. She looked at Russell. I understand, Dad. I understand what you did. I have my whole life because of what you did. Russell could not speak. He just nodded, over and over, holding her hand against his chest. My mom and my stepdad have been on this journey with me, Junie continued. Daniel, my dad too, in every way that counts. He sat with me when I wrote the letter to the producers of this show. He helped me find the words. He told me that the best gift he could ever give me was helping me know my whole family. He's the one who drove me to the airport this morning. Steve had to pause and collect himself before he could speak again. Where is Daniel right now, Junie? Junie smiled. He's in the audience, Steve. Front row, with my mom. The cameras swung. In the front row of the audience, a tall man with kind eyes and graying temples was sitting next to a woman about Russell's age. They were both crying. Daniel Coyle raised one hand in a small wave. Russell looked out at them and let go of Junie's hand for just long enough to press his right hand to his heart. Steve walked to the edge of the stage. Daniel? Catherine? Would y'all please come up here? Daniel and Junie's mother, whose name was Catherine, climbed onto the stage. Catherine reached Russell first. The two of them looked at each other for a long moment. 2 people who had been 22 and 23 when they had a baby together, who had loved each other and lost each other, and had somehow, across 2 decades, managed to keep one promise above all others. Catherine reached out and took both of Russell's hands. Hi, Russell, she said. Hi, Kath. She's something, isn't she? Russell looked at his daughter. She's everything. Catherine turned and gestured to Daniel, who had been hanging back respectfully. Daniel, come here, honey. Daniel stepped forward. He was a tall, soft-spoken man in a charcoal suit. He extended his hand to Russell. Russell, Daniel said, it is the honor of my life to finally meet you in person. Russell shook Daniel's hand, and then, on impulse, pulled him into a brief, fierce hug. The audience gasped softly. When Russell stepped back, his eyes were full of tears again. Thank you, Russell said to Daniel, his voice cracking. Thank you for raising my little girl. Thank you for being there for every birthday I missed. Thank you for teaching her to ride a bike and helping her with her homework and being there when she was sick. Thank you for loving her like she was yours. She is mine, Daniel said gently, and she's yours. She has always been both. There's room enough. Russell nodded. He couldn't say anything else. Steve was openly weeping now. He turned to the audience and said, Folks, I have hosted a lot of episodes of this show. I've seen a lot of families. I've seen a lot of moments. But I want y'all to understand what we just witnessed. We just watched 4 people, a mother, a father, a stepfather, and a daughter, choose love over pride for 18 years. 18 years of choosing what was best for that little girl, even when it cost them, even when it hurt. That is what family looks like. That is what grace looks like. That right there is the realest thing I've ever seen on this stage. He turned back to Russell and Junie. Junie, can I ask you something? Why a pilot? Of all the things you could have done with your life, why did you choose to fly? Junie thought about it. I really don't know, Steve. I just always loved planes. I loved the sky. I loved old aviation books and stories about bush pilots in Alaska. My mom used to take me to the small regional airport in Burlington when I was a kid, and I would press my face against the fence and watch the planes take off for hours. I wanted to know what it felt like to be up there. When I told my parents I wanted to apply to Embry-Riddle, they weren't surprised. I think I was the only one who was surprised when I got in. Did you know your father was a smoke jumper when you applied? Junie shook her head. I didn't know about my dad until my 18th birthday. By then, I had already been accepted. I had already committed. I had already chosen the sky. And then my mom told me about him, and she paused, looking at Russell. I just felt like something had clicked into place, like a door I didn't know was there had opened. Russell wiped his eyes. When your mother told me you were at Embry-Riddle learning to fly, I sat in my truck in the base parking lot and I cried for an hour, Junie. I just kept thinking, somehow she knew. For 20 years, I trusted my life to pilots every time I jumped. Every single jump. And now, my daughter is one of them. The kind of person I owed my life to over and over again. Somehow, she found her way to the cockpit on her own. Steve Harvey turned to the cameras. Y'all, I don't even know what to do with the rest of this game. I really don't. The Brennan family had gathered behind Russell. Patrick had his hand on his brother's shoulder. Marcus Hale was wiping his eyes with the back of his hand. Eamon was just shaking his head over and over, smiling. Teresa was already hugging Junie, having reached her without anyone noticing. Yvette Delacroix walked across the stage from the Delacroix podium and stopped in front of Junie. Honey, she said, I don't know you, but I am so proud of you, and I am so proud of your daddy, all of your daddies. This is a beautiful thing. Junie hugged her. Steve turned to his executive producer, who was standing just off stage. Y'all know what I'm gonna say. The executive producer nodded. We're throwing the game out, Steve announced. Both families are getting the maximum prize. And the Brennan family, we're gonna do a little something extra for the Brennan family. Russell, you spent 20 years and 4 months jumping out of planes for people you would never even meet, protecting homes and forests and families across this country. The least we can do is help your daughter buy her first set of pilot headsets and pay off whatever flight school debt she has left. Russell tried to protest. Steve held up his hand. Russell, listen to me. You don't get to argue with me on this. You don't keep count of the houses you saved. So let me keep count for you. Let me put a number on what you did. Let me make sure your daughter starts her career at that airline next month with 0 debt to her name. Let me do that. Let America do that. Because that's the least America owes you, brother. Russell looked at Steve. He looked at Junie. He looked at his brother and his crew. And he just nodded, because there were no words left in him. Junie stepped to Steve and hugged him. Steve patted her back gently. You take care of your daddy. You hear? Yes, sir. All of them. All 3 of those people standing there, they all love you more than life. You're a rich woman, Junie. Don't you ever forget how rich you are. I won't, Mr. Harvey. Steve looked at the camera one more time. Folks, when this episode airs, I want every single one of y'all to remember something. Family is not always a straight line. Sometimes it's a long, winding road through 20 years of service and 1,000 miles of forest and a kitchen table conversation that breaks 2 hearts in order to keep one little girl whole. Sometimes love looks like letting go. And sometimes, if you're lucky, if you're really, really lucky, love walks back through the door 18 years later in a brand new pilot uniform with gold wings on her chest.